He wasn't always a man people walked past without noticing. Once, he had everything society calls success. A good job, a small but comfortable home, a family that believed in him, and dreams that stretched far beyond his city. His name was Daniel, and if you had seen him 10 years ago, you'd never believe that one day he would be sleeping on cold pavements, counting the stars above as his only companions. Daniel was the kind of man who woke up early, ironed his shirt until it was crisp, tied his tie with pride, and greeted the world with a hopeful smile. He worked as a mid-level manager in a construction company, earning enough to keep food on the table and even save a little. His wife, Laura, was his biggest cheerleader, and together they raised their only son, Ethan, in a modest suburban neighborhood. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. They had dinner together, they laughed at silly movies, they argued about bills, and then made up with whispered apologies before bedtime. But as life often reminds us, stability is fragile. The first crack appeared when the company Daniel worked for started struggling. Projects were delayed, payments were frozen, and layoffs loomed like dark clouds over every employee. Daniel tried to stay strong. He assured his wife that things would get better, that his years of loyalty would protect him. But one Friday afternoon, his manager called him into the office, avoided eye contact, and said the dreaded words, "We have to let you go." It felt as if the floor had been ripped from beneath his feet. At first, Daniel thought it was just a setback. He had savings. He had skills. He told himself he'd find another job within weeks. But weeks turned into months. Rejections piled up. Companies wanted younger candidates, cheaper candidates, or people with newer qualifications. Daniel's confidence began to wither, and with every unanswered application, he felt smaller, less worthy. Then came the medical bills. Laura fell ill with a condition that required expensive treatment. The insurance wasn't enough, and the savings drained faster than he could have imagined. Daniel tried everything, selling furniture, borrowing from friends, even taking on small handyman jobs, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. One night, he came home to find Laura sitting on the edge of their bed, tears streaming down her face. "We can't keep going like this," she whispered. The house they had built their memories in was gone within months, taken by the bank when they couldn't keep up with the mortgage, and with it, so went their sense of security. Laura, fragile from her illness, went to live with her sister. Ethan, too young to understand fully, clung to his mother, while Daniel watched helplessly as his family slipped from his grasp. He promised he'd fix everything, but deep down he knew he had no control. And then the unthinkable happened. Laura's health worsened. Despite treatments, her body couldn't bear the weight of the illness, and one cold winter morning she was gone. The woman who had once been his anchor, his comfort, his hope, suddenly absent forever. That was the day Daniel truly fell. Grief swallowed him whole. Without his wife, without a job, without a home, he wandered aimlessly. He tried to hold onto Ethan, but in his broken state, he couldn't give the boy the stability he needed. Ethan's aunt took him in, and though Daniel knew it was best for his son, handing him over felt like losing the last piece of his soul. Now, stripped of everything, Daniel found himself on the streets. At first, he thought it would be temporary. He told himself, just a few nights, just until I find something. But days became weeks, and weeks became months. The man who once wore suits now wore the same worn-out shirt every day. The man who once held meetings now held out his hand for spare change. Nights were the hardest. He remembered the first time he tried to sleep on a park bench. The wood was cold and unyielding, the air biting through his thin jacket. Every sound made him flinch, the rustle of leaves, the footsteps of strangers, the laughter of passers-by who didn't even glance his way. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, louder than his thoughts, and yet what hurt more than hunger was the invisibility. People looked through him as if he didn't exist. There were days he would sit outside a cafe, watching families eat together. The smell of fresh bread and coffee would torment him, reminding him of mornings with Laura and Ethan. Sometimes a kind soul would drop a coin in his hand, but more often, people would cross the street to avoid him. The shame was unbearable. But perhaps the deepest cut came not from strangers, but from himself. Daniel began to believe the whispers in his own head. You're worthless. You failed your family. You'll never rise again. He hated the reflection he caught in store windows, the sunken eyes, the unkempt beard, the man he barely recognized. He had hit rock bottom, and yet, even at the bottom, there was a strange kind of silence. No more bills, no more responsibilities, just survival. But survival wasn't living, it was existing, and Daniel wondered if this was all his life would ever be. One particularly cold night, as he huddled beneath a thin blanket, staring at the distant stars above, he whispered a question into the darkness. Is this it? Is this how my story ends? The night gave no answer, but somewhere deep within, a small ember still glowed. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of a transformation. For now, though, Daniel was just another forgotten soul, a man broken by life, shivering in the shadows of the city, waiting for a chance, any chance to rise again. Daniel's nights on the street had begun to blend into each other. Cold sidewalks, restless sleep, and the constant growl of an empty stomach became his rhythm. He was invisible to most, but every so often, the universe sends a small reminder that not everyone looks away. It happened one morning outside a bakery. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, teasing him, gnawing at his hunger. He sat on the curb, head bowed, as people stepped over him. He had long stopped expecting kindness, but then a shadow paused. Hungry, Daniel lifted his head. Standing before him was an elderly woman in a faded blue coat, her face kind, her eyes warm. She held out a paper bag. Inside was a steaming loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. He hesitated, shame burning in his chest. But hunger spoke louder. With trembling hands, he took the bag and whispered, "Thank you." The woman smiled. "Don't thank me, son. Just promise me you'll keep going. Life doesn't end here." And with that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. It was just bread, just one act of kindness. But for Daniel, it was more than food, it was a spark. That night, as he sat on the same bench he had claimed for weeks, he thought about her words. Life doesn't end here. For the first time in months, he let himself imagine something different. Could it be true? Could there still be more to his story than this pavement, this hunger, this shame? The thought unsettled him, but it also lit something inside. The next day, Daniel made a choice. He dragged himself to the city library, a place he hadn't entered since his better days. It was warm inside, quiet, filled with people buried in books. For the first time in a long while, no one looked at him with disgust. No one shooed him away. He sat in a corner, picked up a book at random, and began to read. It was a book about resilience, stories of people who had lost everything but fought their way back. As the hours passed, something stirred in Daniel. He realized that while he couldn't control the past, maybe he could influence what came next. That evening, under the dim streetlight, he whispered to himself, "I can't stay like this. Not forever." It wasn't a plan yet, but it was a decision. The next weeks were still hard, brutally so, but Daniel began to move differently. He still begged for coins, but now he saved them. Pennies stacked in secret, hidden beneath the sole of his worn-out shoe. Each coin wasn't just money. It was a piece of his promise to himself. One afternoon, while collecting bottles and cans to trade for change, he met another homeless man named Marcus. Marcus was older, with sharp eyes and a raspy voice. He'd been on the streets longer, but he carried himself with a kind of wisdom Daniel hadn't seen in months. "You look like you don't belong out here," Marcus said, watching Daniel struggle with a bag of cans. "No one belongs out here," Daniel replied. Marcus chuckled. "True, but the streets can eat you alive if you let them. You either give up or you fight back." The words hit Daniel hard. "Fight back how?" he asked. Marcus leaned closer. "Start small. Don't waste your coins on things that keep you here. Save, learn, plan. Most men out here don't die of hunger. They die of hopelessness. Don't let that be you." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The woman's kindness, the book he'd read, Marcus's advice, All of it played in his mind like echoes of something greater, as if the universe was conspiring to nudge him forward. And so he made a promise. Sitting under the open sky, clutching the thin blanket around his shoulders, Daniel whispered a vow into the night air. I will not die on this bench. I will find a way to rise again. For myself, for Ethan, for the life I lost. I will fight back. The words trembled, but they were real. From that day forward, everything he did carried a new weight. When he collected cans, he counted them not just as scraps, but as stepping stones. When he begged, he set aside part of every coin, no matter how small. He began visiting the library regularly, reading books on business, personal finance, and stories of people who had rebuilt their lives. There were setbacks, of course. Days when he barely earned enough for food. Nights when the cold seeped into his bones and threatened to extinguish his will. Moments when the whispers of self-doubt clawed at his mind, telling him he was foolish to dream. But now, there was something stronger inside him, determination. Every day, he repeated his promise, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. Each repetition was fuel, and slowly, the despair that once defined him began to shift into something else. Hope. One afternoon, while flipping through a book about entrepreneurship, Daniel paused at a line that seemed to speak directly to him. Great empires often begin with humble beginnings. What matters is the will to start, no matter how small. He closed the book and sat back, his heart racing. Humble beginnings, that was all he had. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The bread, the library, Marcus's words, all of it had led him to this realization. His life wasn't over. It had simply been reset to zero. And from zero, he could rebuild. With a deep breath, Daniel stood taller than he had in months. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of his story. It was the spark of something greater. And as he walked out of the library that evening, coins jingling softly in his shoe, he whispered again, this time with conviction, I will rise. The promise was made. But promises, Daniel quickly discovered, were easy to whisper in the night and far harder to live by in the daylight. The city was not kind to men like him. His clothes were tattered, his face sunburned and unshaven, his hands rough from weeks of scavenging. Whenever he walked into a shop or approached a business asking for work, the looks on people's faces said it all before their words confirmed it. Sorry, we're not hiring. We don't need anyone right now. Sometimes, they didn't even bother with excuses. They just looked past him as though he were invisible. Still, Daniel refused to give up. One morning, he spotted a crew sweeping the streets. He approached the supervisor, desperate, hopeful. I can help, he offered. I'll work hard, I don't mind the hours. The supervisor eyed him skeptically, then shook his head. We've already got enough men. And just like that, another door closed. But rejection didn't stop him. It only hardened his resolve. Days later, he tried washing dishes at a diner. He had managed to scrape together enough for a cheap secondhand shirt, hoping it would make him look presentable. The manager glanced at him, frowned at his calloused hands, then said, we need someone reliable. You don't even have an address. Sorry. Daniel walked out of the diner with his head low, shame washing over him. But as he passed by the kitchen window, he caught sight of the dishwashers scrubbing piles of plates. For a moment, anger surged through him, not at them, but at himself. Why not me? He thought, why shouldn't I have the chance? Every rejection was like a knife, but instead of bleeding out, Daniel sharpened himself against each blade. He began to wake earlier, searching for odd jobs before the day even began. Carrying loads for vendors in the market, sweeping alleys, helping unload trucks for a few coins. The pay was pitiful, but he treated each coin like gold. He skipped meals, saved instead. Hunger was no longer his enemy. It was his sacrifice, his offering to the life he was trying to build. At night, when most others on the streets curled into themselves for warmth, Daniel walked to the library, sneaking in every hour he could before it closed. He devoured books on business, personal finance, self-improvement, and even manuals on trades like carpentry and repair work. He discovered the power of free seminars online, watching on public computers at the library. He took notes furiously on scraps of paper as though he were in a university classroom. He underlined phrases that struck him, repeating them in his head like mantras. Persistence breaks resistance. Your mind is your greatest asset. Start where you are with what you have, and though the world around him still saw a homeless man, inside, Daniel was transforming. The climb was brutal. There were days his stomach felt like a hollow cave, echoing with emptiness. There were nights when the cold was so sharp he thought he wouldn't wake in the morning. There were mornings he looked in the mirror of a public restroom and almost didn't recognize the determined fire in his own eyes. But then, small victories began to appear. One afternoon, he helped a vendor carry sacks of fruit to her stall. She paid him a few coins and, noticing his sweat and effort, handed him an apple as well. He didn't eat it immediately. Instead, he sold it to another man for double the coin. It wasn't much, but it was profit. And that single transaction lit up his mind. He began looking at opportunities differently, not just as handouts, but as chances to multiply. Another time, while waiting for day work outside a hardware store, he overheard two men struggling to fix a broken cart. He remembered something he had read in one of the library books about basic repairs. Nervously, he offered, "I think I can fix that." Skeptical, they let him try. 10 minutes later, the cart rolled smoothly again. They handed him a small payment. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the validation. The proof that his hours at the library, his sacrifices, were starting to bear fruit. Each rejection he faced after that didn't sting the same way. Instead of breaking him, it fueled him. Every no was a reminder that somewhere out there a yes existed, and he only had to endure long enough to find it. Still, the grind tested him. There were nights when his body begged for rest, but he forced himself to stay awake, scribbling ideas in a battered notebook he had rescued from a trash bin. There were mornings when exhaustion made his legs heavy, but he dragged himself to the market anyway, whispering under his breath, "Not today. I won't quit today." He lived in the tension between despair and hope, between hunger and determination. And slowly, he began to see the climb not as punishment, but as preparation. One evening, sitting beneath the flickering streetlight near the library, Daniel opened his notebook and looked at the coins he had saved. They weren't much, just a handful, barely enough for a proper meal. But to him, they were symbols. Symbols of days fought through, of nights endured, of dreams that refused to die. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered, "It's working. I'm not there yet, but it's working." For the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close, something stronger. It was belief. The man who once thought his life had ended on a park bench was now climbing. Slowly, painfully, but climbing nonetheless. And though he didn't know it yet, his persistence was about to open the door to the opportunity that would change his life forever. It is often said that opportunity does not knock, it whispers. And for Daniel, that whisper came one morning at the marketplace. He had been hauling crates for vendors in exchange for a few coins. Sweat ran down his back, his hands blistered. But he pushed through, determined to turn labor into progress. As he sat on the curb, catching his breath, he noticed a pile of discarded soda cans near a stall. To most, they were trash. But to Daniel, who had read about recycling profits in one of his library books, they were a possibility. He remembered a line that had stayed with him. "Wealth begins with recognizing value where others see none." The idea hit him like a spark. That afternoon, instead of begging, Daniel began collecting cans. He dug through bins, gathered bottles, and filled an old sack he had stitched together from scraps of cloth. By nightfall, his back ached, but the sack was full. He sold the haul to a recycling center. The pay was small, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread, but it was earned. It was his. It was the first time in years Daniel felt a rush of pride, the taste of achievement sweeter than any meal. From then on, He dedicated himself to it. Every morning, while the city was still waking, Daniel combed through alleys, parks, and sidewalks, filling his sack with cans and bottles. Vendors laughed at him, children pointed, strangers wrinkled their noses. But Daniel ignored them. He was no longer a beggar. He was a man running a business, however small. The progress was slow, painfully so. On some days, he barely gathered enough to trade for a single meal. On others, the recycling center turned him away, saying they had too much already. But he kept going because consistency was all he had left to give. Weeks passed, his sack grew heavier each day, and his pile of saved coins began to grow, too. He hid them carefully in the hollow of a broken brick wall, a secret stash no one knew about. Each coin was more than money, it was proof that he was climbing. One evening, while selling his collection, he struck up a conversation with the recycling center manager, a man named Mr. Collins. The man had seen Daniel several times before and finally asked, "Why do you work so hard for so little?" Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and replied, "Because this little is all I have, and one day it won't be little anymore." Something in his voice caught the manager's attention. There was no self-pity, no defeat, only determination. Mr. Collins nodded slowly. "You remind me of myself when I started. Tell you what, I need someone reliable to clean and sort the recyclables here. It's not much, but it's steady. Interested?" Daniel's heart nearly stopped. A steady job, a chance to earn consistently without wondering if tomorrow would be empty. He didn't hesitate. Yes, I'll do it." The work was dirty and exhausting, but Daniel didn't care. Each day, he showed up early, stayed late, and worked with a zeal that surprised even Mr. Collins. And as the weeks rolled on, Daniel saved more than he ever had before. He no longer skipped every meal. Sometimes, he even allowed himself a proper plate of food. His body grew stronger, his mind sharper, his eyes brighter. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. At night, he still visited the library. He studied small businesses, learned basic accounting, and took notes on how to market products. He dreamed bigger than bottles and cans. Then came the turning point. One weekend, while working at the recycling center, Daniel noticed many vendors discarding unsold fruits and vegetables at the end of the day. Perfectly edible, but considered unsellable because of small bruises or spots. To the vendors, they were waste. To Daniel, they looked like an opportunity. He asked Mr. Collins for permission to collect them instead of throwing them away. Soon, Daniel was walking through the market each evening, gathering discarded produce. Instead of eating it all, he began selling some of it at lower prices to passers-by who couldn't afford the fresh stalls. At first, people were hesitant. Who would buy from a man with ragged clothes and a makeshift cart? But Daniel greeted every customer with warmth, treating each sale like it mattered, because it did. Slowly, trust grew. Regular buyers began to appear. The day he made his first real profit, a handful of coins heavier than anything before, he stood under the fading sunlight and let the moment wash over him. For years, he had been invisible. For years, he had been rejected. But now, someone had chosen to buy from him. Someone had seen value in what he offered. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat awake, staring at his coins, tears streaming down his face. Not from sadness, but from triumph. After years of humiliation, he had finally taken control. It wasn't millions yet. It wasn't even hundreds. But it was the beginning. From that point, everything changed. His venture remained small, but his consistency made it grow. Day after day, he expanded his rounds, gathered more produce, and reinvested his earnings into a sturdier cart, better clothes, and eventually a rented stall. Word spread. Customers admired his resilience, his fair prices, and his honesty. And one afternoon, as he stood at a stall, Ethan, his son, now older, walked by with his aunt. The boy stopped, staring at the man behind the cart. "Dad." Daniel froze, his heart pounding. For years he had avoided Ethan, too ashamed to be seen. But now, standing behind a stall that was truly his, with coins in his pocket and pride in his chest, he met his son's eyes with courage. "Yes," he whispered, voice trembling. "It's me." The recognition in Ethan's eyes, the pride in his aunt's nod, the smile that broke across his boy's face. Those were worth more than any coin Daniel had ever saved. This was the breakthrough. The man who once begged on the streets had now built something from nothing. And though the climb was far from over, Daniel finally knew, without doubt, that he could succeed. Persistence had paid off. The tiny hustle that once barely fed him begins to grow. What started as selling snacks on the street corner or collecting cans evolves into a steady stream of income. He reinvests wisely, buying better tools, increasing stock, or improving his service. Step by step, he learns to scale. No miracle overnight, just discipline and vision. His once-worn notebook now overflows with plans, strategies, and goals. He's no longer hustling for survival. He's building a future. Years later, he signs the papers for his first home. No more sleeping under bridges. No more begging for coins. The same man who was once invisible to the world now runs a legitimate business. He employs staff, pays salaries, and shakes hands with respect. He wears clothes not for fashion, but as a symbol of dignity earned. He is financially stable, independent, and most importantly, free. Purpose. But he doesn't forget the nights of hunger, the rejection, the stares of disgust. So he returns to the streets, not as a beggar, but as a benefactor. He feeds the homeless, funds small programs, and mentors others stuck where he once was. To him, true wealth is not what you keep, but what you give. He becomes a living example that pain can turn into purpose. If I can rise from sleeping on cold pavements to owning businesses, from hunger to abundance, from humiliation to honor, then you can too. Your pain is not the end. Your struggle is not permanent. Keep walking, keep fighting, and never give up, because one day your story will inspire millions just like mine.